and harvesting. We have 3 talks in the session, which is scheduled to go until 55 minutes past the hour. Each talk will be 15 minutes with hopefully 2-3 minutes or so for questions. Afterwards, please ask your questions. You can ask your questions along the way using the Q&A tool at the bottom of your Zoom window. That's the best way to ask questions, and then I will moderate those questions after each presentation so that the speakers can answer them, and then any other questions can be answered via text within the Q&A tool afterwards as well. Just a couple of housekeeping notes. One is Open Repositories is governed by a code of conduct, and you can see the link on the screen here. I'll post it in the chat shortly. If you encounter any code of conduct issues during this session, please reference that URL for information on what to do or send a chat message to the panelists within Zoom. And there will also be a community notes Google Doc that people can use to collaboratively take notes on these presentations. So I will post the link to that document shortly as well if someone else hasn't already done so. And so with that, I'm going to stop sharing, and I will turn things over to our first presentation. So I'm happy to introduce Lisa Johnston from the University of Minnesota, Ishel Faniel from OCLC Research, and Katie Wissel from New York University, all in the United States, who will talk about open for all, reusable for whom, a review of what data reusers want and how data repositories can deliver.
Thanks, John. So this presentation that we're going to talk about today draws on research studies examining data reuse. So we're using our knowledge about reusers' needs to identify ways data repositories can deliver or meet those needs. Sorry, my slides weren't presenting. My name is Ishel Faniel. I'm a senior research scientist at OCLC who studies data sharing, curation, and reuse. And I'm joined by Lisa Johnston and Katie Wissel. Lisa is a research data management curation lead and director of the data repository at the University of Minnesota. And Katie is a data services librarian at New York University. Both are also representatives of the data curation network. So it's been great to work with them and think about putting research into practice. So when I started studying data reuse, a lot of attention was actually on the data producers, which made sense. A lot of repositories needed to build their supply. But now, a decade or so later, attention is being paid to reuse more and more. So here are just a few studies that have been going on. And reuse studies tell us a lot. So our objective is, or our question is, why not use those? So first, this one from Curdy found that reusers consider the perceived benefits, risks, and efforts of reuse, but they also want to know about the availability of data documentation in the repository. Yekel and colleagues found that reusers associate trust in a repository with the repository's actions. So things like data processing or metadata or data selection. And lastly, we have Chin and Lansing. And they described designing and developing a biological sciences collaboratory. And in that article, they wrote, in order to reasonably comprehend and apply another researcher's data set, the scientist must grasp the various contexts of the data. So although these authors have studied data reuse in various disciplines and have had different objectives in mind, a common reuse refrain is, what do reusers need? Curdy calls one of the things that they need, data documentation. Yekel similarly describes it as data processing or metadata, and Chin and Lansing call it social and scientific contexts. So repository staff have some control over capturing that information. And by that, I mean they can request that from the data depositors, and they can also display that on the screen to potential reusers to help them make decisions about reuse. And this is really what motivates this work today that we're presenting, where we ask, how do data reusers' needs for context translate into a desirable feature set for data repositories? And then how do data repositories showcase these desirable features in use? So to answer the first question, we draw on a study that my colleagues and I published in 2019 that builds on the work of Chin and Lansing and others. We studied quantitative social scientists, archaeologists, and zoologists, and we were interested in identifying the context that they needed to make decisions about reusing others' data, where they got that information, and then why they needed it. And so today we're going to focus on the context. And here on the screen, you see the 12 types of context, and they're organized across 3 categories. So data production information includes things like information about data collection, the specimen and the artifact, the data producer, data analysis, missing data, and research objectives. Repository information includes information about provenance, the reputation and history of the repository, curation and digitization. And then data reuse information includes things like prior reuse, terms of use, and advice on reuse. So here are those same 12 context types again, and they're in order of the percent of mentions by discipline that we found in the study. So the top bar represents social scientists, the middle bar, the zoologists, and then the bottom bar, the archaeologists. And so you see by discipline what was mentioned the most from top to bottom. And so based on current research and practice, we took these 12 context types and we translated them into a desirable feature set. We reviewed generalists and disciplinary data repositories for those features, but we also created a self-assessment questionnaire for the data repository staff, asking them what context they capture from data producers depositing data, and then what they display, given that information and the work they do. And then we piloted that self-assessment questionnaire with staff at 4 data repositories in the data curation network. And we conducted interviews with them to discuss their self-assessment results, as well as have them identify some of their exemplar features from their repositories. So here you see the table which breaks out the 3 categories of context, the 12 context types, and then the desirable feature set that we came up with. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lisa to discuss example features of a reuser-oriented data repository.
Great, thank you so much. Katie and I are just going to spin through some of the examples that we identified based on our research so far. So this first example of a feature in a repository comes from the University of Michigan Deep Blue Data Repository. They actually require that depositors of data sets include a methodology as a metadata type. So every data set will have this method, which is actually the first piece of metadata that you're seeing right below the title there, that really describes how that data was collected. And what we heard from our reusers is that this is really important because it really helps them understand and get into detail about the depth of that research data collection. And next slide. So 2 other pieces that I'm going to show around data collection features. This one is actually from Minnesota. This is the repository I work with. Is data type is the first one. So this is really helping reusers identify and even facet through the various different subtypes of data in our repositories. And this is actually a required field as well with this repository. And all depositors have to identify kind of out of a controlled vocabulary of which type of data they are depositing. And similarly, at Duke Research Data Repository, they actually keep controlled vocabularies for the file type. So this is the format of the data. And this will help researchers kind of decide whether or not they might have the skills to utilize this data depending on the type of data presented. Next, we're going to turn to a different context type that reusers are looking for. This is information about the data producer. And it wasn't just enough to have the name of the author of the data set, but what our reusers really wanted to know were their institutional affiliations, perhaps where they were educated, noting that which location somebody was educated will help them determine perhaps some of the methodologies or the workflows they might have applied in their data collection protocols. So this is an example from the OSF, which I think does a really good job at bringing together context around the data producer, For example, you see here, they're linking out to their ORCID. They also allow for links to personal websites and Google Scholar so that the data reuser can do some of that investigation on their own about the context of the data producers. And I'll turn it over to Katie for this next one.
Thanks, Lisa. So this context type, again, is about the production of the data, and it is data analysis. So in order for reusers to understand whether or not they'd be able to reuse this, they really have expressed this desire to understand how the data was analyzed. And it's really difficult to document. So I think we're all familiar with this being documented often in a README or a code book, but some repositories have come up with innovative ways to really put this at the front of the reuser's attention through the record. So this is an example from Dryad. And there they have a usage notes section where the files that are going to explain how the data was analyzed are featured on the record for any user to better understand that this is there for them if they were to dive into this data and attempt to reuse it. So it's a very good example of that. Related very closely to this is, again, how would you analyze the data? So data analysis requires more and more that there's the code associated with the research and the data. And there are a couple of different ways to include this in a file. Sometimes it's just zipped up in the zip file and maybe noted. But as a feature in a repository, the ability to have it as a field allows the user to note it on the record itself. So if you look at this example from the Illinois Data Bank, one of the repositories we piloted our research instrument with, they have the related code as a part of the front page record. And so users have an understanding that the code is there for them and that can help them reuse the data and give them confidence that they'd be able to replicate the research that underpins that code.
5 minutes.
Okay. Moving on to a new context type, reusers have expressed, you can see in this quote from Danielle, Frank, and Jacob, they spend a lot of time trying to understand what the original data was meant to achieve. And this is going to inform whether or not it can help their research objectives. So Duke has done a really great job of linking the grant applications and giving the reuser a route back to the original grant application. And here you can see this is the original grant application at the NIH, which includes the summary of their research objectives. So it couldn't be any clearer about what the original intent of this data set was. And that's going to help the reuser, potential reuser, really understand what's going on with this data and what it might do to help their research agenda. Citation is a very important in academics reuse of both all kinds of resource types, especially data. Citation is kind of a key to authority in many contexts. So how these citations could be noted is really a recently enabled function due to some linked data developments, which are very exciting. So here we're going to look at two different ways this can be achieved within a repository. This is from ICPSR. I think we're all familiar with, we can just go back to that one, Michelle, for a second. The citation count. I want to point out that this count of related data publications through linked citations is a goal of many repositories, and it's being piloted at a lot of repositories. ICPSR just happens to be a leader in this space, as I guess we all know. So this is kind of a gold standard for counting those, and you could click through and see all of those related publications. there are other ways to achieve this objective. If we look at the next slide, we can see that there's a really nice job of this being done at the Illinois Data Bank, where they are able to note related articles just without that individual counter. And we dug into this a little bit and asked them how they were able to achieve this. And they note that Google will trigger a note to the curators and to the team whenever a data set is cited, and then they're able to add this to the record to help out the potential reuser.
2 minutes.
Just 2 more, I think. This one is coming from the Harvard Dataverse. They do a really nice job at enabling reusers to understand the terms of use, particularly when there is access to restricted data. Our reusers said that this was difficult to try to find out what that process is, or that they were almost applying for the data twice. So what we saw here with Harvard is that they actually present the terms of use when you try to download the data along with that process. And then one of the really important aspects of how data repositories enable reuse is to reach out to the community itself and provide advice on reuse. And in this case, we were looking for classes or documentation on how to actually reuse the data. And again, another nice example from ICPSR, which has had a longstanding summer data program, which really is engaging reusers in how to interact with their data. And then finally, I think versioning was one of the other areas. And this, of course, is what many repositories do. We enable versioning for our data sets. But what we're looking for here is really the provenance and the history of those versions. And we saw that Zenodo was doing this in a really nice, seamless, and clear way where you can go back and forth between the versions. In this case, this data set had 65 versions, and it was really nice and easy to navigate. And we thought that was a really good example for reusers. So in all, we did not show all of the data types, but we are continuing this work and really looking forward to digging into some of these additional feature sets. I'll turn it over to Ishel for one more slide.
Yeah, sure. So the key takeaways in this are this idea of more and more attention being turned to reuse and how we can really bring potential users into the repositories. As Lisa said, we're going to continue work in this area as well. Which is going to be important moving forward. And then lastly, this idea of new persistent identifier standards and linking technologies, opening up options for enhanced context in data repositories is something that we need to keep an eye on as well. So with that, we end with acknowledgements for projects that have been supporting us, our references, and ask whether or not there are any questions.
Great, thanks so much, Ishel, Katie, and Lisa. That was terrific, and I think it's given everyone a lot to think about. In my case, we're implementing a new data repository at my own institution, and so it gives a lot of ideas of things that we need to work on for sure. So there is one question. There are two questions. One is from Milan, who inserts metadata about the author's Google Scholar ID and ORCID ID in your data repository? Are curators in the US, or do curators in the US have permission to insert this personal metadata?
I can answer that. Just based on the Data Curation Network, we have 12 repositories, all based in the United States. We, as curators, reach out and ask the author. We don't actually do things without their permission. So we would always be doing that in collaboration with the author. And the example that we showed today, I think, was from the OSF, Open Science Foundation. And that I would definitely guess is the author adding those links themselves.
Great. Any other questions? Please go ahead and post them in the Q&A tool. Milan asked another question. Do you have written permissions?
In terms of the changes that we as curators make in a data record, most of that conversation does happen via email. I'm not sure if you're thinking of something a little bit more formal than that, but again, we would facilitate those changes in very close concert with the researcher.
And then I think time for just one more question. Julie Hardesty asks, how are the data types defined as an existing controlled vocabulary?
There was not an existing controlled vocabulary when we at Minnesota implemented the data types. I did actually see a vocabulary very recently, and I don't recall if it was data site or the Canadian Dataverse instance. I'm blanking on who it was, but I did recently see one that was published. I would love to see the community come together around controlled vocabularies for data types. So thank you for that question.
Great. Well, thank you again to all three of you for your presentation. And if people continue to have questions, you can ask those in the Q&A tool, and the presenters can answer them via typing. But let's move on to our second presentation in the session. Pleased to introduce Amy Curry and William Kilbride from the Digital Preservation Coalition in the UK to talk about open for all, but for how long, roles, responsibilities, and accountabilities in the preservation of research data.
Well, thank you very much, John. I shall just pause for a moment. There we are, slides up and running. So thank you for the introduction, the invitation to join you today. We're going to talk about some work we've done from a study called FAIR Forever, which is a study commissioned by the European Open Science Cloud Sustainability Working Group last autumn. And we're going to connect what we found about the strengths and weaknesses of digital preservation capability in the open science community in Europe to repositories and to the open science community more generally. We'll kick off a very quick background from me about the DPC, and then Amy will take over and she will highlight the key findings that relate to digital preservation capability and capacity within the emerging vision of the European Open Science Cloud. And that will lead us to a mention of the recommendations that came out of the report. So just a very quick introduction to who we are. The Digital Preservation Coalition is a global network, and your logo here, as it were, advert over. But let me observe also that we do 6 things. We do advocacy, community engagement, workforce development, and everything else that you can see on the list there. But that's not why we're here today. Let me move on to the work that we've done. So with the need for a study, there was a need for some assessment. We began with an invitation from the Sustainability Working Group of EOSC, European Open Science Cloud, to look at the long-term preservation of fair research data, which was identified as a critical area in sustainability. We needed to address the current state of developments of preservation within what was then still an emerging set of services envisioned for the European Open Science Cloud, as well as to monitor and maintain the emerging EOS capability for preservation. So that's the context of our work. We then set about assessing the strengths and weaknesses, the opportunities and the threats associated with managing research data across the emerging open science landscape in Europe, and to look at how the open science community might benefit from alignment with the knowledge and experience of that wider digital preservation community. That logo festival at the very start there was to try and remind you that digital preservation is a social generational challenge, which involves, as much as it does science and research and repositories within research data management, also banks, all manner of government agencies and industries. So we undertook our work therefore with a set of desk-based assessments, with interviews, with focus groups, with discussions with stakeholders, and that's really where I want to hand over to Dr. Curry, who will lead us through the rest of our presentation.
Sure thing. So we'll have a link to the full report later on with all the details and methodology, but we really wanted to get into the key findings of the study and the identified challenges for the preservation of fair data within EOSC, and of course, connecting that to data more broadly and across repositories. So with that being said, I want to quickly just give an overview of the findings we had relating to the points of intersection between preservation and the FAIR principles. We found strengths which were evident in EOS, so clearly communicated FAIR principles and requirements for the various stakeholders, notably those communicated through different outputs of the FAIR working group and FAIR's FAIR. In our interviews, we spoke with those who were part of the core infrastructures, creating EOSC as a federation of infrastructures. So we were talking with those who were working on making data fair for EOSC. And we found examples of good practice in applying those principles, which intersect with good practice in digital preservation. More specifically, the strengths of having those persistent identifiers, the emphasis on data management and data management plans before and throughout the research lifecycle, thinking about robust storage for large data sets, and then the need for repository audit and certification. However, of course, adherence to FAIR principles does not guarantee long-term preservation. So in other words, FAIR now does not mean FAIR forever. Some of the concerns raised were there was doubt about the implementation and impact of incorporating preservation actions within the data management plans. There were some questions raised about the sufficiency of preserving metadata over time, or thinking about interoperability as the most challenging of the FAIR principles. We called it diachronic interoperability. And then a general sense of what one participant called FAIR fatigue. So this balance between aspirational and achievable goals for preservation within limited time and resources. So among our findings, there were three key messages that we presented to the Sustainability Working Group and as an interim statement. And we wanted to share these kind of to open up to you and discuss how it relates with your work more specifically in different repositories. So first one we found was digital preservation was not explicit in the higher level EOSC vision. Specifically, their strategic research and innovation agenda lacked clarity about preservation. It's not as though there's not acknowledgement that preservation is important and a consensus that it's a core requirement for enabling access, but specific preservation functions remained obscured and miscommunicated. In other words, preservation was still largely implicit. We also found that the term data was used inconsistently, which makes sense given data has different meanings and uses in different domains and disciplines. But want to make sure at the outset, when we're talking about preservation, we're talking about data broadly in all its forms, not just data sets and publications, but code, as mentioned earlier, software, operating systems, all need to be preserved for access and reproducibility over time. So there is a need for clarity. This is the definition we at the DPC use for digital preservation. It's the series of managed activities necessary to ensure continued access for digital materials for as long as necessary. So the emphasis being on a series of different activities, the emphasis on access, what is preservation if there is no access to what's being preserved, and then as long as necessary, really thinking about, are we talking about the length of a project? Are we talking about when funding ends, contextualizing it within research data and EOSC? So this, you may already know this, but it was a finding that still emerged and a need for emphasizing that preservation is more than backup and storage. The findings from the interviews show that the ongoing assessment and renewal of technical infrastructure for EOSC was apparent when looking at things like large quantities of open data and high performance storage. But of course, preservation is more than backup or storage. And the interviewees acknowledged less familiar stakeholders or colleagues may have this misperception, which brings us back to a well-known model within digital preservation, which is over 20 years old, I believe, but still stands strongly. And it's the three-legged stool that just really emphasizes that effective preservation is delivered through infrastructures comprising technology of the repositories, resources, including the know-how of staff, and know why, such as policy. Yet there still is an emphasis on emphasizing one leg over the other. And as we found through our conversations, it pointed, there was a need to point more on the social and organizational infrastructure, which is needed but frequently overlooked. So technological infrastructure is critical, but there really needs to be a clear articulation of commitment within higher level strategic missions, agendas, and policies. Which brings us to the next finding, which perhaps is the most important, and that had to do with roles, responsibilities, and accountabilities for preservation. So EOSC, much as with the broader open science community, takes the view that community is ultimately at the helm and responsible for the preservation of research data. And participants largely accepted this, but noted within the broad community, there are different views of who should be responsible. There was a frequent message about the need for research support for preservation, aligning with the idea of data stewardship, an ambassador role, and it's at times associated more with IT sort of areas and other times having to do with library and information sciences. The point of this being, these are a few in black that were associated with the EOSC training and skills working group, and gray examples of job titles of people we spoke to. But really what we want to push right now is that there was a tendency to put the onus on repositories. And it's not just repositories who need to be involved with preservation. There's actions throughout the life cycle that need to be implemented. And kind of heard throughout the conference is that digital preservation is another thing that repositories are asked to do without additional funding.
That's 5 minutes.
Thank you. So in addition to that, there is this idea of accountability. So it's not just about the roles and responsibilities, but reinforcing the need for asking for communicating with each other and reporting to each other to be held accountable for particular actions. And with that in mind, it connects right back to sustainable data preservation needs, define roles and responsibilities so that accountabilities can be identified, designated, and owned. It is about continued interaction between all the players and actors, communicating what parts they play, and developing skills and training for challenges that will always be ongoing as technology changes over time. In summary, risks remain. There are undoubted strengths within the vision, including the commitment to persistent identifiers, data management, storage, repository certification, and others I mentioned. The roles and responsibilities are still opaque, but are developing over time. And there are those additional challenges tied to existing and available resources, such as the lack of clear funding and costing models for digital preservation and specific skills and training for all these actors. So the digital preservation has what we call the BIT list, the global list of digitally endangered species. And our findings compared to this would put them as critically endangered due to no agencies taking on the responsibility for them or unwilling to unable to meet the needs because of limited resources. All of these helped inform the Sustainability Working Group's Fair Lady report, which we'll be happy to share the link to that. And as mentioned, we have all this, all 38 pages in our final report with all the details about the methodology and findings. But what we want to get to now is we presented 19 recommendations. We will certainly, in less than 5 minutes, not go through them all, but wanted to highlight here for this discussion a few updates. It's 6 months since we did the report. There's been lots of developments. The most important being those having to do with the EOSC Association. There's been a development of a task force on long-term data preservation and a liaison role for helping with sustaining EOSC. But really, we want to talk about where you see your role or roles within the open science ecosystem and or EOSC, and where you think the responsibilities of preservation of fair data lies. Our recommendations are to adapt work plans to include quality improvement mechanisms where these do not already exist. We mentioned DPC Rapid Assessment Model, but of course there's other ones, such as Science Europe recently came out with their maturity matrices for sustainable data. The Digital Curation Center is also have their ACME maturity model. So really thinking about quality and maturity assessments and certification through, for instance, Core Trust Seal or other certification organizations. And then that was the most urgent. And then also talking about experiences with data management plans and auditing, working with funders, and
1 minute.
Thank you. And assessing the critical costing models needed that are tied to personnel, not technology, being able to gather that information and make a case for digital preservation. So in summary, these are all the things that sustainable data preservation needs. We're putting at the top of the list those roles, responsibilities, and accountabilities, and policy strategies and enhancements. And those cannot proceed without those funding models and costing parameters. Maturity and all those other things mentioned. So that was my last slide, but I'll put it here in case there are any questions.
Great, thank you, Amy and William. Yeah, I'm sure this a number of things you said ring true to a lot of the people here. They certainly did for me, including the idea that repositories are expected to provide digital preservation without that necessarily being made explicit what that entails. Any questions from the audience? We have a couple minutes.
John, I could just jump in for a moment
Sure.
to observe. Amy mentioned the BIT list, which is the global list of digitally endangered species. It's a biannual affair where we gather together recommendations from the community as to what people think are critically endangered or in any kind of risk. And actually, by coincidence, it's open for nominations this week. So if you've got something that's worrying you, something that's challenging to preserve, then by all means let us know, and I've put a link into the bit list on the chat.
Great, very timely. Lisa has a question real quickly. Did your participants desire use cases or maybe preservation fails in addition to benchmarking tools?
Yeah, I'll maybe let Amy pick up on that in more detail, but use cases was one of the real key elements in actually setting things up for people to comment upon and to make recommendations around. Amy, do you want to reflect on those?
Yeah, so EOSC more broadly had the opportunity for use cases, but in terms of preservation, that's something that I think that will really be picked up with the development of the advisory groups. But also in terms of DPC, like so much of our knowledge relies on our members going through use case scenarios and reporting back to us. So our participants, we, at the point that we spoke to them, EOSC was still in that stage of development where the services weren't accessible per se. They weren't through that catalog. So it was more of, we called them possible use case scenarios. So we did, in the focus group, we basically talked about what are your challenges? What do you need? How would having access of this through a web affairs services help enable or restrict that?
Great. Well, thanks again to you both. Given the time, we'd better move on to our third and final presentation here. Thank you. Happy to introduce Jose Carvalho from University of Minho in Portugal, and his colleague Lautaro Matas from La Referencia to talk about the entity relationship meta model from repositories to aggregators, the case of La Referencia, and the RCAAP joint project.
Thank you, John. Thank you for introduce. Thank you for the organization to allow us to present our work. Well, we'll talk about this experience, but first I will do a very brief introduction to this context. Please, Jose, can you? This is the context of this collaboration. As Bianca, our president, talked today in the keynote, we, La Referencia, develop a software that runs in all these countries, but also we are collaborating with FCT Portugal and the University of Minho in the development of the next version. This presentation is about this new version and the very first experiences with the new version that is in development. And this is a collaboration between La Referencia technical team, the FCT and University of Minho teams, with IPICT, the Institute of Science and Technology Information of Brazil. So the software, as I said, is running in all those nodes, but also it's also is part of the FCT portal. Next slide, please. So to give some context, why we are working in it, we are extending our software. At first, the software was developed for harvest, transform, enrich metadata of literature repositories and aggregate them to publish the aggregated metadata in the national and the regional portal of La Referencia. But in the last years, with the development of new guidelines, more richer guidelines with more information, with the new version of the repository software as DSpace 7, with the ability of address entity and relation information, the importance of the CRIS systems and other sources, we moved to develop a new version of the software, and we designed a new architecture to aggregate different metadata sources as CV platforms, CRIS system, and other sources. So the idea is to process that data and create a model, an entity relation model behind, and use that model to create some new services and platforms to the other actors of the national and the regional ecosystems. So next slide, please. So very briefly, the system now considers a different kind of sources that a part of the literature and data repositories. We are also working with CRIS systems and other sources like national CVs information. We have this experience with IPICT in Brazil with the VR CRIS system that is a national aggregation project that contemplates to work with Celates, that is one of the most biggest CV databases in the world. So we have now some outcomes of the collaboration with IPICT Brazil and with ERCAP. We have the integration with Vivo. One thing that I had in the last slide is that we collect that sources, but and then process the information in order to feed other platforms such Vivo to create also services like REST AIPs for search or giving services to other platforms, or also populate search or aggregation indexes like Elasticsearch and Kibana dashboard. So this is an example of the first outcomes of populating a Vivo instance, an Elasticsearch and Kibana dashboard, and the experience that we are doing with ERCAP, that is the subject of this presentation, that is that now Jose will talk more about this. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Lautaro, for this introduction. I will present now the context of application of this software, the La Referencia Harvester software, in the ROCAP search portal, which is a national search portal in Portugal, mainly focus on a concept that is to be a unique search point for searching information from the Portuguese scientific outputs, also initially based on a network of repositories, and then we added more resources, and also to create an open infrastructure for open science at the national level, and also an opportunity to centralize some services for the community. So basically, we harvest repositories and journals of publications. Mainly, we have one research data repository, but we also integrate, for example, the Oasis BR search portal, which is a portal from Brazil, and also the initiative Cielo Portugal in this harvester. So why we need this new meta model of entity relations? So basically, from many years now, we had the needs to develop new services for the community, something that is integrated in existing systems that can be usable, functional, and also the need to have different services for different stakeholders, like the author, the funders, the institutions, etc. So additionally, we also try to overcoming some previous limitations, like the lack of detailed metadata, for example, and also to be able to analyze the relation between these entities of publications, authors, fundings, etc. And also to incorporate the search portal on the functional vision of the science management at the national level. So how we do it? Basically, we take some existing guidelines and standards. Basically, we use already the driver guidelines, and now we are starting to implement OpenAir 4 guidelines at the repository levels and also at the harvester level that are based on different COAR taxonomies. And also another very important aspect is to implement locally the identifiers for authors, for publications, etc. Additionally, we take the use of the architecture of the software itself to be able to make and improve different process over time. So from the ingest of a repository to the availability of the information on the ROCAP portal, we have different steps. And at the search portal level, we expose this in the web interface via API and also OIPMH. So this integrated vision is also part of a national initiative, which is the PT-CRIS. Basically, it's a kind of a standard and guidelines to be able to implement these functionalities in the different systems of the science management. It's also focused on the community, focus on the researcher at the center of these services, and also the adoption of these tools and metadata schemas. The actual developments we are doing on the harvester, we try to figure out here 3 different steps. The first one, it's at the repository level and also the journal level, where we make the information available through the entity exposure. So if we use the OpenAir guidelines 4, we can already expose this information organized by entities. Then the ROCAP portal harvests this information daily from repositories and journals based on the specific metadata model, and then we perform additional actions like the duplication of this information. And then with this information, we can make additional services through an API or the web interface for the end user. So
5 minutes.
At the repository level, we consider already the space 5, 6 where we implement some functionalities to be able to expose this information, but also we wait for the space 7 to implement better and also in the large scale this entity-based information at the repository levels. For the journals, there is also a solution based on the plugin, for example, for Open Journal System. And then the new metadata model, it's an abstract model where we can adapt and configure different metadata models. So we are able to design our own metadata model. So basically, we can have in different countries or different contexts a different metadata model based on the same concept of relations of entities. So we can define the different relations we need for our services. So this is a very important aspect because it allows the software to be reused in different contexts for different purposes also. So this is an example of the entities we use, the publication, people, organizations, funding and services with different types of attributes. And this example is, for example, an author. A person is an author of the publication with a specific attribute like John Doe. So it's the name used in this specific publication, for example. Additionally, we also try to implement something that we can use to search entities and make these different views over these different entities. So basically, we have an API based on all this information that can be used to integrate with other systems in the national context. So an example of this service, for example, is a national curriculum system that we have. And the basic implementation will be ask for a specific ORCID and retrieve all the publications and funding of this author, for example, with this identifier. Another aspect we share for you, for the community, is what you can do to be able to, in the future, use this kind of system, because we understand that this is some kind of a future approach of the repositories, mainly if we consider the space 7. And our advice is to you to incorporate identifiers for the different entities in the repositories and in the journals, comply with the international guidelines, and probably in few years you will be able to use these tools to incorporate this information in the national harvesters or regional harvesters.
2 minutes.
Also, with this, we need quality of information to be able to provide quality services. So for this, we have also some validation process incorporated. The data of the repositories and the journals is very important. So we need quality on the sources we harvest. This international collaboration implies also a macro functional view. So we need to be able to have and to consider different contexts over the globe. And also these developments marks a new era for the repositories, but also for aggregators that needs to adapt to these new functionalities of repositories, as we have said with the space 7, for example. And with all this new information and this new organization of the information, we are allowed to develop new services based on the identifiers, based on entities, and mainly to develop an open infrastructure by and for the community. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Yeah, quite an intriguing project. We have a minute or so for questions. Maybe if there's one question, and then other questions can be answered in the Q&A or in the collaborative notes document. Any questions for Jose or Lator? All right, well, thank you again very much. And again, if folks have questions, you can post those in the Q&A or in the collaborative notes document or get in touch directly with our presenters. Please join me in thanking all of our presenters in this session. And I would like to remind everyone that coming up next in this same Zoom webinar room is the closing session of the conference, where you'll hear more about the current status and future of the IDEAS Challenge, as well as about next year's Open Repositories 2022 conference, among other things. So I hope you'll stay for that session to help us wrap up. And finally, just wanted to thank our sponsors again for their generous support of the conference and making this all possible. And thank all of you for your participation. And so with that, we'll get ready for the next session.